Thank you for this invitation. That it was absolutely an honor to be here, especially in the Italian courtyard. So it's the perfect location to speak about what I would speak tonight about the Classic Reloaded. The Classic Reloaded is an idea of reading the relation between contemporary Italian art and the classic roots. So the dialogue and contrast with classicism has always been one of the essential themes discussed by artistic research in Italy. The return to the classical art criteria had different significance depending on periods. I'm referring, of course, on the modern and contemporary period. So starting from metaphysics to return to the order. I mean, these are all the movement that started at the beginning of the 20th century. And there was already there a very strong relation on rethinking about classicism. So metaphysics, return to order, Novecento, arte povera, and then appropriation art until the Transavanguardia, which was the last one in the 80s. But still, young Italian artists are still today confronting themselves with this topic. So the classicism always has been strongly present in the artistic and visual culture of Italian art. Artists often take inspiration from it, suggesting a return to the aesthetic criteria or evocating a critic consideration on art values. What I will propose tonight is a small journey, just an introduction, of course, for the time that we have, into this topic through four themes. There are four perspectives on which it is possible to read this relation of Italian art and classical. And it was, of course, it is a relation, and it is at the same time a reinvention of the classic through their contemporary side. In each of these works here presented, there is a strong relation with the classical visual culture through different perspectives. And the four themes that I will talk about are: the first one, it's the ruins, fragments, and shadows. Ruins, fragments, and shadows. We'll start with this one. Of course, the theme of the ruins, as portrayed in art, is long. Have a long tradition. I would say, starting in the modern time, already in the 18th century. I took an image of Goethe portrayed in the ruins of Rome. Of course, that was the period of Illuminism and Neoclassic. The Grand Tour and the Romanticism were all about the fascination of the ancient. Upon here you can see the Goethe portrayed between. But it was the idea of Neoclassicism was the return to the classic criteria, so the proportion and the ideal beauty. So it was a very specific things that Illuminism and at that time was rethinking the classical in their art. So completely different it is already in the modern time with this painting by Giorgio De Chirico, L'archeologo. It's from 1927. Here it's no more the relation with the ruins as a mythical time, but it's the idea of the metaphysics. So metaphysics has no time. The metaphysic is an idea of time which doesn't refer to any specific time. It's a sort of an enigma. You know, the metaphysics is all about the enigma. So it was something that it was a suspended time, something that it could speaks about just in some way a different dimension of the time. Then, after the modern time, we come to the mid-60s. The mid-60s, I would talk about some masters of the arte povera movement. And here we have Michelangelo Pistoletto, Venus of the Rags. Here it's completely changed. From a mundane, the ruins were speaking about a mundane time, a time that was a historical time. In the metaphysic ideal, the time was an ideal time, and here the ruins becomes fragments through postmodernity. The ruins are no more ruins referring to the time, but are referring to identity. The identity of the artist, first of all, but the identity of the death of the author. The concept of the identity of history and time and space collapse completely. So, in this Venus of the Rags, you see this Venus is confronted with a pile of rags, reconfiguring her meaning and entering the real and the actual world. The Venus has no more his aura of classical art, but perform as a real body, collapsing the idea of present and past, of low and high culture. So it was completely a different perspective. That's very. It's important to understand that even if there is a very specific identity, formal identity through different ages, the meaning is completely another thing, and that's important in this perspective, in this specific perspective, to understand also the context, the historical context where the works have been done. So it's a different attitude from many of other perspectives that was presented in this session and this conference that has an immediate relation with the formality. So it is I return to understand the identities through the context, the geographical and the historical context. This is another example, is Yannis Kounellis. Yannis Kounellis, you know, it's a Greek artist that moved to Rome in the 60s, and it was one of the masters of the arte povera movement. Here's doing a performance, reenacting the fragments of the Apollo. Again, this idea of performing the fragments of the past is in this performance of Yannis Kounellis a relation with history become also a political gesture, a gesture of criticism against contemporary capitalistic society, a gesture of protest. So it's a completely different meaning, as I told you. Later on his career, Yannis Kounellis did a lot of works with this idea of fragments and history. So history became, in Yannis Kounellis, a very important theme in his work. But more and more less political, it started to be conceptual. I mean, this fragment speaks about the biography of the artist, his provenience from Greece, his status of a dislocated man, of a refugee. That is also important here through this idea of dislocation, the fragments and the elements that he used in it. For example, here you have an installation of Yannis Kounellis at Museo Capodimonte in Naples, which is a very important museum of archaeological and ancient art. And he took some of the pieces that were already in the museum to make a sort of a conceptual display of these fragments, that what is we can consider fragments, totally changing their meanings. So at this point, this idea of the fragment and of our contemporary relation to the past and the ruins, it's very well written by Marc Auger in a... Di qua. Wow. No. That stopped. Okay. Vabbè. No. Vabbè. I read it a caption from Marc Auger's book. He says, the sight of the ruins allow us to grasp the existence of a time that is not what history books write about, or that restoration try to bring to life. It is a pure time, not dated, absent from our world of images, simulacra, and reconstructions, from this our violent world whose rubble no longer have the time to become ruins. A lost time that art sometimes managed to find. And this is the attitude... Sorry, no, sto andando indietro. No, it doesn't work. Okay, so that was Yannis Kounellis. Then Claudio Parmigiani, which is another artist from the 70s, but a little younger than the Arte Povera generation group. And here you have a clear idea of that Fragments has lost even his reference to history. It's just become a real a destruction of it, a rubble, as Marc Auger says in his text. Again, we have a very known photographer, Italian photographer, which is Mimmo Iodice. It doesn't work. No? Can you move? No. Yeah. Mimmo Iodice is an Italian photographer, always in black and white, and he, from the 80s, so it's a younger one, but he's made photographers of archaeological works, archaeological remains, giving them a new life in some way, no? Giving them a new stage, and of course, again, it's about identity, which one of the most important artists which works around the idea of identity and fragments is, of course, Giulio Paolini. Giulio Paolini is another master of, I would say, conceptual Italian art, more than Arte Povera, because he started with a group of Arte Povera, but then he moved very quickly away. Yeah. Sorry, that it doesn't work very well. Can you move it for me? No. Back. Yeah. It's okay. Thank you. So this is Giulio Paolini. Giulio Paolini, I told you that it was the most important conceptual Italian art, Italian conceptual artist. And it's all about the fragmented identity of the author and of the artist. So he questioning representation, he questioning the idea of which is the real and which is the copy. In fact, he always used casts of ancient sculpture or copies of important paintings of the past. He really works on the theme of history of art. It's one of the most clear work around this. Again, still speaking about fragments, we come to a younger Italian artist, which is very well known for her performances, Vanessa Beecroft, which has a strong relation also with the classical formalistic and composition. But here, some years ago, she started to move to still working on performance, but also working now on sculptures. And sculpture, these are the fragments of bodies of their performance models, which are clearly questioning gender, sexuality, and power. So from the fragments from the death of the author, from questioning the role of the artist, here we come to another master of Italian art, which is Giorgio Morandi, which for all his life did a direct relation with one of the most important genre of the history of art, which is the natura morta, of course. So again, there is a very specific relation with this, but the object has gone through a process of deobjectivation, which questioned the status of the object and the status of his representation in art. Catch in a sort in between the real and the unreal, floating in a suspended space and in a suspended time. So in some way he get away from the whole tradition of the natura morta with all the meanings that the natura morta was during the different periods having, and getting in a very, very modern perspective of the objectivation of status or representation and so on. So the direct relation with this research is, again, Claudio Parmigiani, which did a lot of works of this that he calls shadows. Shadows are made with real smoke. He make these works putting the real object into the box and filling it with smoke. So in some way, it's no more a process of representation, but it's a process of performing the object. So, and performing the object give then the result of his absence through this process. So, the second very present theme in Italian art in relation with classical art is the theme of mirrors, reflections, and illusions. Starting from another very, very known painting by Giorgio De Chirico. It's a self-portrait, but again, there is the relation through a whole tradition of self-portraits in art that starts from very, very ancient time. But here there is immediately another perspective, a different perspective, a very modern perspective, because the self-portrait, it's no more just a self-portrait, but it's a game of mirroring sight, no? Mirroring the fact that he's looking at us as public, but he's also looking at him as the author, but the author is looking at him. So it's making a sort of a triangular collapsing and circuit of meanings that start the idea of questioning the role of the author, the role of the artist, and the role of the representation. That was immediately taken off from another master of Arte Povera movement, which is Michelangelo Pistoletto, that from the beginning of the 60s started to do his very famous mirror paintings. So this painting is directly painted on over mirrored surfaces, so that the public can reflect into it, and reflecting into it, it's becoming part of the work of art. So it's entering the work of art like this. Those are two mirrors. The scene is the Annunciation, so it's a very classical theme. And when you are in front of this mirror, you mirror yourself inside the work of art. So you become part of the work of art. And if you notice the figure that Michelangelo always put it on the work, it's of actual size. It's a human size, because he wants to be comfortably inside the picture. So in some way it speaks also through proportion, what's in making the entrance in it. Again, about mirrors, reflections, and specularity, it is Giulio Paolini with this works called Mimesis. Again, as I told you before, it's all about the questioning of reflections. This is a young Italian artist that came out during the 90s. It's Francesco Vezzoli. That it's taking the same attitude of the masters, but changing the meaning again. So he's making absolutely mocking and with an irony and sarcastic attitude the relation with history of art. And it's no more about the questioning of the author and the artist, but it's really getting himself performing into the art through his attitude and his sort of theatrical attitude. So the third theme, I will go through. Really, it's really an introduction, of course, of the theme. So there's much more to say about it, but of course, it was just to giving an introduction. So the mise en scène and masquerade, of course, have the relation with the long tradition on Italian culture of theater and carnival. The famous Commedia dell'arte, which is this continuous porous identity between the truth and the fake, the comedy and the drama, which in fact, if you think about it, is the status of art. So start again with a metaphysical work by Giorgio De Chirico. You can easily understand how theater and mise en scène was playing an important role on getting this idea of the metaphysic in relation, of course, also with the classical and the ancient art that becomes something different, something that can be reinvented completely. Completely. Again, Giulio Paolini, if you think about his work, a very important part of it is the installment of the display of the work of art. So as a scenography, in some way. He's trying to do installation and which are speaking about space and speaking about identity through a direct relation with the space. But we already saw this. This is what it's very interesting because it's again it's a work by Giulio Paolini, who is taking a picture out of the Chirico painting, where the Chirico painting is masquerading himself in ancient costume, and he's putting the Chirico inside his studio. So there is these layers that comes to different dimension of time. This again is Francesco Vezzoli in his totally disruptive attitude, quoting a painting by Giorgio de Chirico, a very famous painting by Giorgio de Chirico, and changing the face of the Apollo del Belvedere with Greta Garbo. But one of the most important artists that did tableau vivant for all his life is Luigi Ontani. Luigi Ontani is an artist from the 70s who started to do a reenacting of classical works of art through a sort of reinventing all the reference to. I should go a little faster because the time is running out. And then again, Vanessa Beefcroft reenacting with her performances in classical pose and compositions, which becomes completely something different, because when these models are enacting, there is nothing regarding sexuality. The models are standing, are completely doing little movements for hours, and they become statues, they become a sort of objectivation. This is another example of Luca della Robbia, Resurrezione di Cristo, reenacted by Stefano Arienti with the drawings. And then the last theme I will go through very quickly. It's veil and unveil. The veil has a long tradition in Italian and art, especially during the 18th century to virtuosism. This is the Cristo Velato. But then reinvented also in contemporary art. Luciano Fabbro, this is Lo Spirato, the 1970s, that is quoted by Maurizio Cattelan in his All, which are a reference not only with the history, but also with the drama of the chronic history of today. Again, a reference with Antonio Corradini, La Velata of the 18th century, and Claudio Parmigiani, and the last one with this performance of, again, of Vanessa Beecroft, who started to move from nudity to the veil, with, you know, that the veil that we have to stop here, but has a long meaning in contemporary time with politics, gender, sexuality, and so on. Thank you.